Hello there and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we are traveling back to a world so different from our own that it can be hard to believe it was the same planet. A world where ice sheets 2 miles thick covered what is now London and New York and Chicago. A world where woolly mammoths moved in herds across frozen plains and cave lions hunted in the darkness beyond the firelight. A world where sea levels were so low that you could walk from Asia to North America, and where the Mediterranean was smaller and colder and stranger than it is today. This is the world of the Ice Age, and it is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. It is the world that made us. The Ice Age shaped the human body and the human mind and the human instinct to gather around a fire in the dark. It drove our ancestors to paint the walls of caves with images of such power and beauty that they still stop us in our tracks 50,000 years later. It forced us to cooperate and to innovate and to adapt in ways that produced the cognitive and social capabilities that eventually allowed us to build civilizations. Everything that came after, every city and every empire, and every piece of art and music and science was made possible by the humans who survived the Ice Age and by what surviving it did to them. Tonight we are going to spend time in that world. We are going to walk its frozen plains and sit in its cave shelters and watch its extraordinary animals move through the twilight. We are going to meet the people who called it home and understand what they knew and how they lived and what they left behind. If these quiet journeys through history bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy and your breathing slow. And as the night deepens around you, come with me to the Ice Age. Let us begin. The Ice Age was not one event, but a long series of freezes and thaws stretching back millions of years. When most people hear the words Ice Age, they picture one long frozen era that ended when the first humans arrived with spears and the mammoths disappeared. The reality is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. The Earth has experienced many ice ages throughout its history. The most recent series of glacial periods began approximately 2.6 million years ago, when the planet entered a long phase of climatic instability, known to scientists as the Quaternary Ice Age. Within this long phase of overall cooling, the Earth has cycled repeatedly between glacial periods, times of intense cold and expanding ice, and interglacial periods, warmer intervals when the ice retreated and conditions became more like what we experience today. These cycles have been remarkably regular. For the past million years or so, the dominant cycle has operated on a rhythm of approximately 100,000 years. Around 90,000 years of glacial cold, followed by around 10,000 years of interglacial warmth. Then, the cold returned. We are currently living in an interglacial period called the Holocene that began approximately 11,700 years ago when the last glacial period ended. So in the long view of Earth's climate history, the warm, comfortable world we live in now is the exception rather than the rule. The Ice Age is the normal condition of this planet in its current astronomical configuration, and the warmth we enjoy is a temporary respite in a much longer story of cold. The cycles that drive ice ages are written in the geometry of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. The question of what causes ice ages is one that puzzled scientists for well over a century before a Serbian mathematician named Milutin Milankovic developed the theory that now bears his name. In the early 20th century, Milankovic calculated that the Earth's orbit around the Sun and the tilt and wobble of the Earth's axis all vary in predictable cycles that change the amount of solar energy reaching different parts of the Earth's surface at different times of year. 3 separate cycles are involved: the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, how circular or elliptical it is, varies on a cycle of approximately 100,000 years. The tilt of the Earth's axis varies between about 22 and 24.5 degrees on a cycle of approximately 41,000 years. And the wobble of the Earth's axis, the way it traces a slow circle like a spinning top that is winding down, completes a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. These 3 cycles interact with each other to produce variations in the distribution of solar energy across the Earth's surface that are sufficient to tip the climate into or out of a glacial period, depending on the particular combination of factors at any given time. The key factor appears to be the amount of solar energy reaching the northern hemisphere in summer. When northern hemisphere summers are cool, snow and ice from the previous winter do not fully melt before the next winter arrives. Over centuries and millennia, the ice accumulates, and the growing ice sheets reflect more and more sunlight back into space in a process called ice albedo feedback that amplifies the initial cooling and drives the climate deeper into a glacial period. The Milankovic cycles do not act alone. Changes in greenhouse gas concentrations, particularly carbon dioxide and methane, ocean circulation patterns, and the distribution of continents all play roles in amplifying or dampening the climate response to orbital forcing. But the fundamental rhythm of ice ages and interglacials is written in the geometry of the Earth's path around the Sun and in the slow wobble and tilt of the axis on which we spin. The world at the peak of the last glacial maximum was almost unrecognizable. The last glacial period reached its most extreme point approximately 20,000 years ago in a phase scientists call the last glacial maximum. The world at that moment was so different from the world we know that it requires a serious effort of imagination to picture it. Ice sheets covered approximately 30% of the Earth's land surface. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and extended as far south as what is now New York and Chicago and Kansas City. In some places, this ice sheet was more than 3 kilometers thick. 3 kilometers of solid ice sitting on what is now farmland and forest and city. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and extended across much of northern Europe, reaching as far south as what is now London and Amsterdam and Berlin. The British Isles were largely buried under ice, except for a narrow strip in the south of what is now England that was a frozen treeless tundra, rather than the green and temperate landscape we know today. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today, because so much of the world's water was locked up in ice. That difference of 120 meters transformed the map of the world. The North Sea did not exist. Britain was connected to continental Europe by a wide plain that geologists call Doggerland, and that was home to rivers and lakes and forests and the animals and people that lived in them. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected to the Asian mainland in a vast peninsula that scientists call Sunderland. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined into a single landmass called Sahul, and across the Bering Strait, where the cold waters now separate Asia from North America, there was a broad grassy plain called Beringia that was the pathway by which the first humans reached the Americas. The Ice Age landscape of Europe was a world of cold open plains and scattered refuges of warmth. Imagine standing in what is now central France 20,000 years ago. The scene before you is nothing like the rolling farmland and vineyards and forests of modern France. Ahead of you stretches a vast open plain of frozen ground, the permafrost extending many meters deep into the earth. The vegetation is sparse. Grasses and sedges and low shrubs cover the ground in a mosaic of pale gold and dusty green. There are no trees except in sheltered river valleys where the ground is slightly warmer and where birch and pine can find enough warmth to survive. The sky is vast and pale and often grey. The wind is constant and carries with it a cold that is not like the cold of a winter day in the modern world. It is a deep, persistent structural cold that has been building for thousands of years and that shapes everything about the landscape and the life within it. This environment is called the mammoth steppe, and it was the dominant landscape across an enormous area stretching from Western Europe across Russia and Siberia to Alaska and the Yukon. It was not a barren wasteland. It was extraordinarily productive in its own terms. The grasses and sedges of the mammoth steppe supported an abundance of animal life that rivals or exceeds the great wildlife spectacles of modern Africa. Woolly mammoths moved across it in herds. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed its frozen grasses. Cave lions hunted its herds. Spotted hyenas competed with early human hunters for the same prey. Giant deer, called the Irish elk, carried antlers of such enormous span that they are still among the most impressive structures produced by any animal in evolutionary history. And through it all moved small bands of human beings wrapped in the skins of animals they had hunted, carrying their tools and their fires with them across a landscape that was trying, in the most fundamental climatic sense, to kill them. The woolly mammoth was the defining creature of the Ice Age and deserves to be understood on its own terms. The woolly mammoth is perhaps the most famous extinct animal in history. Its image appears in the cave paintings of Ice Age Europe, and its bones have been found across a vast area from Western Europe to Siberia to North America. In the permanently frozen ground of Siberia, entire mammoth carcasses have been preserved in the permafrost, with their fur and their skin, and even the contents of their stomachs intact. These extraordinary finds have allowed scientists to understand the woolly mammoth in a level of detail that is impossible for most extinct animals. The woolly mammoth was not simply a hairy elephant. It was a highly specialized animal, perfectly adapted to the cold open landscapes of the mammoth steppe. It was roughly the same size as a modern African elephant, though some individuals were considerably larger. Its most obvious adaptation to the cold was its coat. The outer layer consisted of long guard hairs that could reach almost a meter in length and that shed water and snow from the animal's back. Beneath the guard hairs was a dense undercoat of fine woolly hair that provided insulation against the extreme cold. And beneath the skin was a layer of fat up to 10 centimeters thick that provided additional insulation and served as an energy store through the long cold winters when food was scarce. The mammoth's tusks were extraordinary. They could reach lengths of 4 meters in large males and curved in a spiral that gave them both beauty and function. The tusks were used to sweep snow aside to reach the grasses beneath, to dig for roots and bark in frozen ground, and probably in combat with rival males during the breeding season. Mammoths were highly social animals. Like modern elephants, they lived in family groups led by older females whose accumulated knowledge of the landscape, of water sources and food patches and migration routes was essential to the group's survival. The family groups of mammoths were part of larger social networks that allowed individuals to find mates and share information across the vast distances of the mammoth steppe. They communicated with each other through rumbles and trumpets and through low-frequency sounds that could travel for miles across the open plain. They were intelligent, emotionally complex animals that mourned their dead and showed care for injured group members in ways that are recognizable across the enormous gap of time and species that separates us from them. The woolly rhinoceros was another giant of the Ice Age world, and one that is less well known than it deserves to be. Sharing the mammoth steppe with the mammoths was another large and impressive herbivore that tends to be overshadowed by its more famous companion. The woolly rhinoceros, Coelodonta antiquitatis, was a massively built animal with 2 horns, the front one of which could reach over a meter in length. Like the mammoth, it was covered in thick fur and had a layer of fat beneath the skin for insulation. It was a grazer rather than a browser, and its mouth was adapted for cropping the short frozen grasses of the steppe. The woolly rhinoceros appears in cave paintings across Ice Age Europe, where it is sometimes depicted with remarkable accuracy, showing the distinctive hump over its shoulders and the downward angled head position that allowed it to graze efficiently in the wind-swept landscape. Cave lions were the apex predators of the Ice Age world, and they were considerably larger than modern lions. The cave lion, Panthera leospelea, was the largest lion that has ever existed. It was roughly 10% larger than a modern African lion, and unlike its modern relative, it appears to have lacked a prominent mane. Cave paintings show what appear to be cave lions with faintly striped or spotted coats, suggesting they may have retained juvenile markings into adulthood. They hunted the large herbivores of the mammoth steppe and competed directly with human hunters for the same prey. Their bones have been found in many of the same cave systems used by early humans, suggesting a complex and sometimes dangerous relationship between the two species as they competed for the same sheltered spaces in the limestone hills of Ice Age Europe. Cave bears were among the most impressive animals of the Ice Age and left their mark on the landscape and on human imagination. The cave bear, Ursus spelaeus, was a massive animal, considerably larger than any modern bear. Large males could weigh over 500 kilograms and stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. Unlike most modern bears, which are omnivores, the cave bear appears to have been primarily a vegetarian, feeding on plants and perhaps supplementing its diet with honey and insects in the manner of many modern bears. The cave bear's most significant impact on human life came from its use of cave systems as hibernation sites. The same caves that early humans sought for shelter were also favored by cave bears for their winter sleep. The relationship between early humans and cave bears was complex and probably dangerous. Cave bear bones found in sites like Chauvet Cave in France show that humans and bears used the same spaces, though not necessarily at the same time. Some researchers have suggested that the cave bear held a special significance for the human communities that shared its landscape, and there is some evidence, though it remains controversial, that early humans may have engaged in ritual behavior involving cave bear skulls. The Irish elk was another extraordinary animal of the Ice Age, whose name is somewhat misleading since it was neither exclusively Irish nor a true elk. Megaloceros giganteus was the largest deer that ever lived, and its most striking feature was its antlers, which could span nearly 4 meters from tip to tip and weigh as much as 40 kilograms in large males. These enormous antlers are among the most impressive structures produced by evolution and have fascinated scientists for centuries. The Irish elk appears frequently in Ice Age cave art, where its distinctive profile, with its massive antler span is rendered with an accuracy that demonstrates the close observation of the humans who painted it. The humans who lived through the Ice Age were not primitive savages, but sophisticated and adaptable people. It is easy and tempting to imagine Ice Age humans as barely surviving, huddled in caves, crude and desperate. The archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The people who lived through the last glacial maximum were fully modern human beings in every cognitive and physical sense. Their brains were the same size as ours. Their capacity for language and social complexity and planning and creativity was identical to ours. What differed was only their technology and their knowledge, and in their technology and knowledge, they were in many ways more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They had to be. The environment they lived in was unforgiving in a way that most modern people will never experience. A failure of planning, a wrong decision about shelter or clothing or food storage could kill an entire group in a matter of days. The humans who survived and thrived in the Ice Age world were people of extraordinary competence and knowledge who understood their environment in a depth and detail that most modern people cannot imagine. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They knew where the herds moved and when they would arrive. They knew how to read the weather from the color of the sky and the behavior of animals. They knew how to make fire in wet conditions and how to preserve food and how to construct shelters that could protect against extreme cold. And they knew how to maintain the social relationships that were the real foundation of survival in a world where no individual or small family could survive alone. Clothing in the Ice Age was not simple animal skins thrown over the shoulders, but sophisticated engineered garments. Surviving an Ice Age winter required clothing that modern outdoor equipment companies spend enormous resources trying to replicate. The archaeological evidence for Ice Age clothing is indirect because organic materials like hide and fur rarely survive, but we can reconstruct the sophistication of Ice Age clothing from several lines of evidence. Bone needles, some of them astonishingly fine, have been found at Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia. These needles are nearly indistinguishable from modern sewing needles, and they tell us that Ice Age people were making fitted sewn garments, not simply wrapping themselves in unshaped hides. Fitted clothing that covers the wrists and ankles and neck, that has a hood to protect the face, that is made in layers to trap air and provide insulation, is the difference between surviving temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius and dying from hypothermia within hours. The Inuit people of the Arctic have developed clothing systems over thousands of years that allow them to survive in some of the coldest conditions on Earth. Ice Age Europeans were solving the same engineering problem with the same fundamental materials, animal skins and furs and plant fibers, and the bone needles they left behind tell us they were doing it with considerable skill. The raw materials for clothing came primarily from the animals they hunted. Mammoth hide provided thick leather for outer garments and footwear. Woolly rhinoceros fur and the furs of wolves and foxes and cave bears provided the warmth layer closest to the body. Sinew from the same animals provided the thread that was stitched through the bone needles to join the pieces together. Ice Age clothing was the product of an enormous knowledge base about animal materials and their properties that took generations to accumulate and was passed down through careful teaching. Shelter in the Ice Age ranged from natural caves to remarkable constructed structures. The image of Ice Age humans as cave dwellers is only partially accurate. Caves were certainly used for shelter and for other purposes, as we will see when we discuss cave art. But caves are relatively rare in most landscapes, and the human population of Ice Age Europe ranged far beyond the areas where suitable caves existed. In the open plains of Russia and Ukraine, where there are no limestone cave systems, archaeologists have found the remains of remarkable structures built from the bones of woolly mammoths. At sites like Medzirish in Ukraine, the foundations of circular shelters have been excavated, consisting of hundreds of mammoth bones and tusks arranged in interlocking patterns to create walls and supports. The mammoth bone houses at Medzirish are estimated to have provided shelter for several families, and they represent a sophisticated engineering solution to the problem of building in a landscape without timber or stone suitable for construction. The bones were heavy and required considerable effort to transport and arrange. They provided a framework over which skins were stretched to create weatherproof walls. Fire hearths inside the structures provided warmth, and the insulating properties of the skin walls would have made the interior habitable, even in extreme cold. These structures tell us that Ice Age people were not simply opportunistic cave users, but active and ingenious builders who could create comfortable living spaces in almost any landscape given sufficient skill and social cooperation. Fire was not simply a tool for warmth in the Ice Age, but the organizing principle of human social life. Fire in the Ice Age was everything. It was warmth against a cold that could kill in hours. It was light in the long, dark winters of high-latitude Europe and Asia. It was the means by which food was cooked and made safer to eat. It was protection against the predators that prowled the darkness outside the camp. And it was the center around which social life organized itself, the place where people gathered to eat and talk and make tools and tell the stories that transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next. Making fire reliably in the wet and cold conditions of an Ice Age winter was a significant technical achievement that required both knowledge and the right materials. Ice Age people used a technique called percussion fire, starting in which iron pyrite was struck against flint to produce sparks that were caught in a tinder of dry fungus or dried plant material. Both iron pyrite and flint are found at many Ice Age archaeological sites, and the association of the two materials together with the presence of burnt bone and charcoal tells us that fire was a constant and carefully maintained presence in Ice Age camps. The management of fire required skill and attention. Keeping a fire going through a long, cold night required the right fuel and the right technique, and a division of responsibility within the group that meant someone was always awake and tending the flames. The social organization of fire watching and fire keeping was itself a form of cooperation that helped bind human groups together, and that gave the night a structure and a rhythm that made it less terrifying and more manageable. The cave art of the Ice Age is among the most extraordinary evidence of human creative capacity ever discovered. Perhaps the most astonishing legacy of Ice Age humanity is the art they made. The painted caves of Ice Age Europe are among the most profound works of art ever created by human beings, and they have the added quality of being somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 years old. The cave at Chauvet in the Ardèche region of France contains paintings of such quality and sophistication that when they were first discovered in 1994, many experts refused to believe they could be as old as the radiocarbon dates suggested. The animals depicted at Chauvet, lions and rhinos and mammoths and cave bears and horses, are rendered with a naturalistic accuracy and a confident flowing line that would be impressive from any era. The Chauvet artists used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals a three-dimensional quality. A horse's head emerging from a bulge in the limestone, a rhinoceros horn following the curve of the rock. They used shading to suggest volume. They arranged groups of animals in ways that suggest movement and relationship. Some panels at Chauvet show animals drawn in overlapping layers that create a sense of a herd in motion, of animals emerging from the darkness of the cave into the flickering light of the torches the artists carried. Altamira in Spain and Lascaux in France are perhaps the most famous painted caves. Lascaux was discovered in 1940 by 4 teenage boys following a dog that had disappeared into a hole in the ground. What they found inside has been called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory. The Hall of the Bulls at Lascaux contains paintings of extraordinary scale, with aurochs and horses and deer rendered in black and red and yellow ochre across the curved ceiling of the cave in compositions that use the space with the confidence of an experienced muralist. The Altamira cave in Spain, discovered in the 1870s, contains a ceiling covered in bison, painted in postures of resting and rolling and bellowing that capture the weight and life of the animals with remarkable fidelity. When the cave was first brought to scholarly attention, most experts refused to accept that the paintings could be prehistoric. They were simply too good. The idea that people living tens of thousands of years ago before writing and before cities could produce art of this quality was simply incompatible with the prevailing assumption that human cognitive development was a simple progression from primitive to sophisticated. The cave paintings demolished that assumption and forced a complete reassessment of what Ice Age humans were capable of. The purposes of Ice Age cave art remain debated, but the art itself tells us something profound about the human mind. Why did Ice Age people paint the caves? This question has occupied researchers ever since the cave paintings were first recognized as prehistoric. The most popular early theory was that the art was connected to hunting magic, that by painting the animals they hunted, Ice Age people believed they could gain power over them or ensure success in the hunt. This theory has largely been abandoned because the animals depicted in the paintings do not correspond neatly with the animals that Ice Age people actually ate most often. Reindeer bones dominate the food refuse at most Ice Age sites in Europe, but reindeer are relatively rare in the cave paintings. Mammoths and rhinos and cave lions, which were rarely eaten, and in the case of lions never eaten, appear far more frequently than the hunting magic theory would predict. A more recent and more compelling interpretation is that the caves served as ritual spaces where altered states of consciousness, perhaps induced by the disorienting darkness and the hypnotic flickering of torchlight, allowed shamanic practitioners to access what they experienced as a spirit world. The deep recesses of the caves, where the most elaborate paintings are often found, would have been extraordinarily disorientating spaces, where the combination of darkness, strange acoustics, cold, and the physical effort of crawling through narrow passages could produce altered states without any chemical assistance. What we can say with confidence is that the cave paintings were not casual decoration. They were made with intention and skill and considerable effort by people who had a profound and sophisticated inner life, and who were using the caves to engage with something they considered important and meaningful. Whatever they believed it deeply, and they expressed that belief in art that has survived 40,000 years to move us still. Music and personal ornament in the Ice Age tell us that beauty and expression were fundamental human needs, even in the harshest conditions. The cave paintings were not the only form of artistic expression in the Ice Age world. Ice Age people also made music. Bone flutes have been found at several Ice Age sites in Europe that are among the oldest musical instruments ever discovered. The oldest known flutes found at sites in Germany and dating to around 40,000 years ago, are made from the wing bones of vultures and from mammoth ivory, and are carefully crafted with precisely positioned finger holes that would have produced a range of notes. These are not crude noise-making devices. They are sophisticated musical instruments that required considerable skill to make and to play. The existence of flutes at this early date tells us that music was already a developed art form 40,000 years ago, and that the Ice Age humans who made and played them had the same capacity for musical expression and appreciation that we have today. Ice Age people also adorned themselves with jewelry. Beads made from shells and animal teeth and ivory have been found at Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia. Some of these shells were carried hundreds of kilometers from the sea to the interior, where they were pierced and strung and worn as personal ornaments. The effort involved in obtaining these materials and transforming them into jewelry tells us that personal appearance and social identity were as important to Ice Age people as they are to us. The red ochre that appears at many Ice Age sites was probably used as body paint in a tradition of body decoration that connects Ice Age people to every human culture in every era that has followed them. The Ice Age in North America was shaped by the Laurentide ice sheet and the extraordinary animals that lived alongside it, while Ice Age Europe was home to mammoths and cave lions and cave bears. The Ice Age in North America had its own remarkable cast of large animals that lived alongside the advancing and retreating ice. The Columbian mammoth, a close relative of the woolly mammoth, but larger and adapted to a wider range of habitats, roamed across the southern part of the continent, from California to Florida to Mexico. The mastodon, a more distantly related proboscidean that was stockier and more forest adapted than the mammoths, lived in the woodlands of the eastern part of the continent. American horses, which were smaller than modern domestic horses, moved in herds across the plains. Camels, which had actually originated in North America millions of years earlier, before migrating to Asia and Africa, still grazed the western grasslands. Giant ground sloths, some of them as large as modern elephants, moved slowly through the forests, and the most formidable predator in the Ice Age Americas was the sabre-toothed cat, Smilodon, whose canine teeth could reach 20 centimeters in length, and which was built like a muscular lion, with the bulk and power to bring down the largest prey on the continent. The American cheetah, the dire wolf, the short-faced bear, which was larger than any modern bear and capable of running at speed, and the American lion, all added to a predator community that was as rich and diverse as anything alive today. This was the world that the first humans to reach North America encountered when they crossed from Asia during the last glacial period. Beringia was the pathway that connected Asia to North America, and it was not simply a land bridge, but a landscape in its own right. The crossing from Asia to North America during the Ice Age was made possible by the drop in sea level that exposed the floor of the Bering Strait. But Beringia was not simply a narrow crossing point, a corridor between two continents. It was a vast landscape in its own right, stretching up to 2,000 kilometers from north to south, and covering an area larger than many modern countries. Beringia was part of the mammoth steppe ecosystem, and it supported populations of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and horses and bison and the predators that followed them. The people who eventually crossed from Asia to North America may not have experienced their journey as a crossing between continents. They were simply following herds across familiar steppe landscape in the same way their ancestors had been doing for generations. The question of exactly when the first people reached North America remains one of the most actively debated questions in archaeology. The traditional model placed the first Americans in the continent approximately 13,000 years ago, when an ice-free corridor opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, allowing people to move south from Beringia into the interior of the continent. But a growing body of evidence suggests that people reached the Americas considerably earlier than this, perhaps as much as 20 or even 30,000 years ago, possibly by moving along the Pacific coastline in small watercraft, rather than waiting for an interior ice-free corridor to open. Whatever the exact route and timing of the first Americans, what is certain is that by around 13,000 years ago, people were present across much of North and South America and were hunting the large animals that had never before encountered human predators. The Clovis people were the first clearly documented human inhabitants of the Americas, and they arrived into a world of extraordinary abundance. The most well-documented early human culture in the Americas is the Clovis culture, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive stone tools were first identified. The Clovis people made stone spear points of remarkable quality that are among the most beautiful and technically accomplished stone tools ever made anywhere in the world. The Clovis point is a fluted point, meaning it has a channel flaked from the base of both faces to allow it to be more securely attached to a spear shaft. The technical skill required to produce a Clovis point is considerable and involves a level of controlled stoneworking that takes years of practice to master. The Clovis people hunted the large animals of North America, and their spear points have been found in direct association with the bones of mammoths and mastodons and other large animals across a wide area. What is striking about the Clovis people is how rapidly they appear to have spread across the continent. The earliest Clovis sites appear around 13,500 years ago, and within a few centuries Clovis tools are found from Alaska to Patagonia. This represents one of the fastest documented human population expansions in prehistory, and it was driven by the extraordinary abundance of large prey animals that had never before encountered human hunters. The extinction of the Ice Age megafauna was one of the most significant ecological events in the history of the planet. At the end of the last Ice Age, something extraordinary and terrible happened. The great animals of the Ice Age world disappeared, not gradually over millions of years in the way that most evolutionary extinctions occur, but rapidly, in geological terms almost instantaneously, in a wave of extinction that swept across the continents as the climate warmed and as human hunters arrived. The woolly mammoth was gone from most of its range by around 10,000 years ago. The woolly rhinoceros disappeared at roughly the same time. The cave lion and the cave bear and the Irish elk all vanished. In North America, the extinction was even more complete. 35 genera of large animals disappeared from North America between approximately 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. The mammoths and the mastodons, the horses and the camels, the giant ground sloths and the sabre-toothed cats, the dire wolves and the short-faced bears and the American cheetah, all gone. What caused this mass extinction has been debated by scientists for decades, and the debate has not been fully resolved. The two main candidates are climate change and human hunting. The end of the Ice Age brought rapid and profound changes to the climates of both hemispheres. The landscapes that the large animals of the Ice Age had evolved to live in were changing faster than they could adapt to. The mammoth steppe was contracting and fragmenting as the climate warmed. The open grasslands of North America were being replaced by forests in which the large grazers of the Ice Age were less well adapted. But climate change alone may not be sufficient to explain the pattern of extinctions, because the Earth had experienced many previous warm interglacial periods, without the same catastrophic loss of large animals. The critical difference in the last extinction event was the presence of human hunters. The first Americans arrived into a continent full of large animals that had no experience of human hunters and no evolved fear of them. These animals would have been relatively easy to approach and kill, and the combination of this naive prey and skilled human hunters may have been enough to push animal populations that were already stressed by climate change over the edge into extinction. This overkill hypothesis, first proposed by the ecologist Paul Martin in the 1960s, remains controversial but has considerable support from the timing of extinctions, which correlates remarkably closely with the arrival of humans on each continent and island. The Great Melt that ended the Ice Age was one of the most dramatic climate events in human history. Around 20,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. The ice sheets that had covered a third of the Earth's land surface began to retreat. The process was not smooth or gradual. The climate lurched between warmer and colder phases as the ice sheets melted and reformed in response to complex feedbacks between the ocean and the atmosphere. Around 12,900 years ago, a sudden cold snap, called the Younger Dryas, sent temperatures plummeting back toward glacial conditions over a period of just a few decades. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,200 years before ending as abruptly as it had begun, with temperatures in some parts of the world rising by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a matter of decades. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated. The most widely accepted explanation involves a massive outpouring of fresh water from the melting Laurentide ice sheet into the North Atlantic Ocean that disrupted the circulation of ocean currents which normally transport warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic and moderate the climate of Western Europe and Eastern North America. Whatever its cause, the Younger Dryas was a dramatic reminder that climate change does not always happen gradually. It can happen fast, faster than civilizations can easily adapt to. The floods that followed the melting of the ice reshaped the map of the world, and the memory of those floods may have survived in ancient mythology. As the ice sheets melted, the water had to go somewhere. Sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters over the course of the deglaciation, though not smoothly or evenly. The rise was punctuated by episodes of catastrophic flooding, when ice dams holding back enormous lakes of meltwater suddenly gave way and released their contents in floods of almost incomprehensible scale. Lake Agassiz, the enormous meltwater lake that formed south of the Laurentide ice sheet, at its maximum extent, was larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. When its ice dam broke around 8,200 years ago, it released an estimated 163,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water into the North Atlantic in a matter of months. The resulting rise in sea level was several meters, and the disruption to ocean circulation produced a cold event that caused temperatures to drop across the northern hemisphere for approximately 150 years. The flooding of Doggerland, the lowland plain that connected Britain to continental Europe, occurred gradually over thousands of years as sea levels rose, but may have included episodes of sudden catastrophic inundation as tsunamis generated by the collapse of underwater landslides swept across the low-lying plain. One such event, caused by the Storegga slide off the coast of Norway around 8,000 years ago, generated a tsunami that inundated the coasts of what is now Scotland and Norway, and may have permanently severed the land connection between Britain and Europe in a matter of hours. The Black Sea flood, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, suggests that around 7,700 years ago, the rising Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus and flooded what had been a freshwater lake in a catastrophic inundation that may have driven out human communities living on the fertile shores of the ancient lake. Whether this event was truly catastrophic or merely gradual remains debated. But the idea that the memory of great floods might have survived in the mythology of cultures that lived through them is compelling. Flood myths appear in the traditions of cultures around the world, from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the Hebrew story of Noah to the flood myths of ancient India and China. The universality of these stories may reflect a genuine shared human memory of the floods that accompanied the end of the Ice Age and the drowning of the landscapes that had been home to our ancestors. The end of the Ice Age transformed the conditions of human life and made civilization possible. The end of the last Ice Age was not simply a climatic event. It was the precondition for everything that followed in human history. The warmer and more stable climate of the Holocene made agriculture possible in a way that the cold and variable climate of the Ice Age had not. The warming and increased rainfall that accompanied the end of the Ice Age transformed the landscapes of the Middle East and North Africa, creating the conditions in which wild wheat and barley could grow abundantly, and in which human communities began experimenting with the cultivation and management of these plants. The first agriculture appeared in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, the arc of productive land stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through what is now Turkey and Syria and Iraq and Iran, around 10,000 years ago. From there, it spread across Europe and Asia in one of the most consequential transformations in human history. Agriculture allowed human populations to grow far beyond the numbers that hunter-gatherer communities could sustain. It allowed the accumulation of food surpluses that could support specialists, people who did not grow food themselves, but who made tools or conducted trade, or kept records or led armies. It allowed permanent settlements to develop, and permanent settlements became villages, and villages became towns, and towns became cities. The entire sweep of recorded human history, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the digital age we live in now, was made possible by the end of the Ice Age and by the climatic conditions that followed it. We are, in the deepest sense, children of the melt. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have given us an extraordinary window into the climate of the Ice Age. One of the most remarkable scientific achievements of the 20th century was the development of the technique of drilling ice cores from the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, and reading in those cores a detailed record of past climates. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are built up from snowfall that has been accumulating for hundreds of thousands of years. Each year, a new layer of snow falls on top of the previous year's layer and is gradually compressed into ice. Trapped within the ice are tiny bubbles of ancient air that preserve samples of the atmosphere as it was when the snow fell. By extracting these bubbles and analyzing the gases they contain, scientists can determine the concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere at any point in the past, going back as far as 800,000 years. The ice cores also contain other climate proxies, chemical signatures that allow scientists to reconstruct past temperatures, the amount of dust in the atmosphere, the frequency of volcanic eruptions, and many other aspects of past climates. What the ice cores have revealed about the Ice Age climate is both fascinating and sobering. The temperature swings between glacial and interglacial periods were large, up to 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. The transitions between cold and warm periods were sometimes extremely rapid, with major temperature changes occurring over decades or even years. The carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere during the coldest phases of the Ice Age was approximately 180 parts per million, roughly half of the pre-industrial level of about 280 parts per million, and less than half of the current level, which is now above 400 parts per million. The ice cores thus provide both a detailed history of past climate change and a baseline against which to measure the unprecedented speed and scale of the climate change that human industrial activity has produced. The last woolly mammoths survived on an Arctic island until less than 4,000 years ago. The extinction of the woolly mammoth was not as complete or as rapid as most people assume. While woolly mammoths disappeared from their mainland range across Eurasia and North America between about 10 and 12,000 years ago, a small isolated population survived on Wrangel Island, a remote island in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Siberia, until approximately 3,700 years ago. This means that woolly mammoths were still alive when the pyramids of Giza were being built in Egypt. The Wrangel Island mammoths were smaller than their mainland ancestors, a phenomenon called island dwarfism that occurs when a large animal becomes isolated on an island with limited resources and is subject to selection pressure for smaller body size. The Wrangel Island population survived in isolation and eventually went extinct, possibly due to a combination of the limited gene pool of a small isolated population, changes in vegetation on the island as the climate continued to warm, and possibly the eventual arrival of human hunters. The survival of mammoths on Wrangel Island until so recently has inspired some scientists and entrepreneurs to consider the possibility of using the genetic material preserved in frozen mammoth remains to resurrect the woolly mammoth through genetic engineering. The ancient DNA of woolly mammoths has been sequenced, and the differences between the mammoth genome and that of its closest living relative, the Asian elephant, are now well understood. Whether this knowledge could or should be used to create a living mammoth is a question that raises profound ethical and ecological issues that scientists and philosophers and the public are only beginning to grapple with. The next ice age is already overdue, but human activity may have postponed it indefinitely. One of the most thought-provoking questions raised by our understanding of ice age cycles is what happens next. Based on the Milankovic cycles and the pattern of previous glacial and interglacial periods, the current interglacial should have been coming to an end around 8,000 years ago, and the Earth should by now be well on its way into the next glacial period. But it is not. Temperatures are not falling. The ice sheets are not growing. Instead, the opposite is happening. Temperatures are rising, ice is melting, and sea levels are climbing. A paper published in 2008 by William Ruderman proposed that the next ice age was prevented by human activity that began 8,000 years ago, when early farmers started burning forests to clear land for agriculture, and when the development of irrigated rice paddies in Asia began adding methane to the atmosphere in quantities that offset the natural decline in greenhouse gases that would otherwise have allowed the next ice age to begin. Whether or not Ruderman's early anthropogenic hypothesis is entirely correct, what is certain is that the Industrial Revolution of the past 200 years has added so much carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere that any natural tendency toward cooling has been comprehensively overwhelmed. We are not heading toward an ice age. We are heading in precisely the opposite direction. The ice that covered a third of the Earth's surface 20,000 years ago is still retreating, and the rate of that retreat is accelerating in ways that make the future of our own interglacial as uncertain as any period in the long story of the Earth's climate. What the Ice Age tells us about ourselves and about the world we live in. The Ice Age is not simply a chapter in the history of the Earth's climate. It is a chapter in the history of the human species. The humans who lived through it were us. They had our brains and our emotions and our capacity for love and fear and creativity. They looked up at the same stars we look up at, and they painted on cave walls in the darkness with the same impulse toward beauty and meaning that drives human artistic expression in every culture and every era. They cooperated and competed and told stories and made music and grieved for their dead and cared for their children in ways that we would recognize immediately if we could sit with them around one of their fires. What the Ice Age adds to our understanding of ourselves is a sense of the depth of the human story and of the resilience and adaptability that is at the core of what we are. Our species survived conditions of extreme cold and extreme environmental instability that would challenge any living civilization. We did it not through brute strength, but through intelligence, through cooperation, through the transmission of knowledge between generations, and through the capacity to find beauty and meaning even in the hardest circumstances. The cave paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux and Altamira are not relics of a primitive past. They are evidence of a fully human present that reached back 40,000 years and that connects every person alive today to the people who stood in the flickering torchlight of the Ice Age caves and painted the animals they knew and loved and hunted on the walls of the living rock. Those paintings survived 40,000 years of darkness. They are still there, and when we stand before them, we are standing in the presence of ourselves. And so we come gently to the end of our journey through the Ice Age. We have stood on the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe and watched the mammoths move through the pale winter light. We have sat in the warmth of a mammoth bone shelter while the wind moved across the permafrost outside. We have followed the cave lion's tracks through fresh snow and understood why the humans who shared that landscape built their fires so carefully and tended them so well. We have crouched in the darkness of Chauvet Cave and watched an Ice Age artist trace the outline of a horse on the limestone wall by torchlight with a confidence and a beauty that 40,000 years has not diminished. We have walked across Beringia on the heels of the first Americans and understood that the journey was not a dramatic crossing, but a simple following of the herds across familiar landscape into unfamiliar land. We have watched the ice melt and the seas rise and the world transform from the cold open plains of the mammoth step into the warmer and more familiar world in which agriculture and cities and history became possible. And we have understood that the Ice Age is not something that happened to other beings in another world. It happened to us, to our ancestors, to the people whose dinar we carry, whose art we still stand before in wonder, whose fires we are still in some sense sitting around. The Ice Age shaped us, and we are still, in every cell of our bodies and every fold of our minds, the people it made. If this quiet journey through one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of our planet brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the mammoth steps settle into silence. Let the cave fires burn down to embers. Let the painted horses rest in their darkness. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The Ice Age has kept its watch long enough for one night. Sleep well. Good night. The tools of Ice Age people were far more sophisticated than their reputation suggests and reveal minds of extraordinary capability. When we think about Ice Age technology, the image that comes to mind is often a crude stone chopper or a simple pointed rock. The reality of Ice Age toolmaking is almost the opposite of this image. The stone tools produced by Ice Age hunters in Europe and Asia during the period known as the Upper Paleolithic, roughly between 45,000 and 10,000 years ago, represent the peak of stone working technology. The blade technology that characterizes this period involves the production of long, thin stone blades from carefully prepared cores, with a control and a precision that requires years of practice to develop. A skilled Ice Age napper could produce dozens of identical blades from a single core, each one sharp enough to shave hair, and each one suitable for use as a knife, a scraper, a saw, or a projectile point. These blades were often hafted into handles of bone or wood or antler, using adhesives made from birch tar or pine resin to create composite tools of considerable effectiveness. The spear thrower, called an atlatl, was one of the most important weapons of Ice Age hunters. This device, a short rod with a hooked end, effectively extended the length of the hunter's arm and dramatically increased the speed and force with which a dart could be thrown. A skilled user of an atlatl could throw a dart with enough force to penetrate the thick hide of a mammoth or a woolly rhinoceros from a distance sufficient to reduce the risk of being trampled or gored. Atlatls have been found at Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia, and some of them are works of art as well as tools, decorated with carved animal figures of remarkable quality. The bone and antler technology of the Ice Age produced tools of great sophistication, including harpoon points with barbs, needles of extraordinary fineness, and carved objects whose function we do not always understand, but whose craftsmanship we can only admire. Ice Age people had a detailed and sophisticated understanding of the animals they hunted that went far beyond simple predator-prey relationships. The cave paintings of Ice Age Europe tell us many things, but one of the most striking is the depth of observational knowledge that Ice Age people had of the animals that shared their world. The animals in the paintings are not generic or schematic. They are specific. A mammoth in the Chauvet cave is recognizably a mammoth with its high domed head and its sloping back, and its curved tusks depicted with an accuracy that only comes from close and repeated observation. A bison at Altamira is rendered in postures of rolling and resting and bellowing that demonstrate a knowledge of bison behavior that could only have been accumulated through years of watching these animals at close range. Ice Age hunters needed this knowledge, understanding the behavior of the animals they hunted, knowing their seasonal movements and their social structures and their responses to danger was as essential to survival as the weapons they carried. A hunter who understood that woolly rhinoceroses tended to move into the wind and that they were most vulnerable on their flanks was a more effective hunter than one who simply approached from any direction and hoped for the best. The knowledge of animal behavior accumulated by Ice Age hunters was a form of natural history as detailed and as accurate as anything recorded by modern zoologists, just expressed in practice and in art rather than in writing. The social organization of Ice Age human groups was complex and sophisticated and involved networks that extended far beyond the individual camp. Life in the Ice Age was not lived in isolation. Small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals were the basic unit of Ice Age social life. But these bands were part of larger networks of related groups that maintained contact through regular meetings and through the exchange of goods and people. The evidence for these networks comes from several sources. The most striking is the distribution of raw materials. At many Ice Age sites, flint and obsidian and other high-quality stone materials have been found that originated from sources hundreds of kilometers away. This tells us that Ice Age people were either traveling enormous distances to obtain these materials, or that they were participating in exchange networks that moved materials across the landscape through chains of trading relationships. Shell ornaments from the Mediterranean coast have been found at sites deep in the European interior. Amber from the Baltic appears at sites across Central Europe. These long-distance connections were not simply commercial, they were social. The exchange of materials and objects between groups was a way of maintaining relationships, of creating obligations and alliances that could be called upon in times of need. A group that suffered a failed hunt or a harsh winter could call on the support of allied groups whose territories might be experiencing better conditions. This mutual support network was one of the most important survival mechanisms available to Ice Age human communities, and the exchange of prestige objects like shells and amber and finely made tools was the visible expression of the social bonds that made it possible. The Ice Age world was not uniformly cold, but had pockets of relative warmth that served as refuges for both animals and people. During the coldest phases of the last glacial period, the ice sheets covered enormous areas that are now temperate and productive. But the Ice Age world was not uniformly frozen. There were pockets of relative warmth, areas where the combination of geography and local climate produced conditions mild enough to support forests and a greater diversity of life than the surrounding tundra. These refugia, as scientists call them, played a crucial role in the survival of both animals and plants through the coldest phases of the glacial period. The Iberian Peninsula, the area that is now Spain and Portugal, was one of the most important refugia in Ice Age Europe. The mountains of northern Iberia sheltered the south of the peninsula from the worst of the cold air flowing off the ice sheets to the north, and the Atlantic coast provided a moderating influence on the climate. Many species of trees and animals that survived the Ice Age in Iberian refugia spread back across Europe as the climate warmed, repopulating landscapes that had been stripped bare by the cold. Human populations also contracted into refugia during the coldest phases and expanded from them as the climate improved. The genetic diversity of modern European populations reflects this pattern of contraction into refugia and subsequent expansion in patterns that geneticists have been able to trace by comparing the DNA of people from different parts of Europe. The painted caves of southwestern France and northern Spain may partly reflect the concentration of human population in this refugia area during the coldest phase of the Ice Age, when this region was one of the most densely inhabited parts of Europe. The relationship between Ice Age humans and the landscape they lived in was one of profound intimacy and mutual dependence. Ice Age people did not live apart from their landscape. They were embedded in it in a way that most modern people can barely imagine. Every feature of their environment, every hill and river and patch of woodland and seasonal flood plain was intimately known and named and understood in terms of its resources and its dangers. They knew where the reindeer crossed the river in autumn and where the salmon ran in spring. They knew which caves flooded in snowmelt and which stayed dry. They knew where the best flint could be found and which valleys offered shelter from the worst of the winter winds. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and transmitted through story and song and direct teaching from those who knew to those who needed to learn. The landscape was not simply the backdrop to Ice Age life. It was the text from which Ice Age people read the information they needed to survive. A change in the behavior of a particular animal could signal an approaching storm or the early arrival of winter. The flowering of a particular plant could tell an experienced forager that other resources would be available nearby. The tracks in fresh mud, and the bent grass of a sleeping place, and the scratch marks on a tree all spoke to Ice Age people in a language of signs and meanings that is now largely lost to us, but that was as rich and complex as any written language. Learning to read this language was the primary education of every child who grew up in the Ice Age world. The spiritual and symbolic life of Ice Age people was rich and complex and clearly important to them. The cave paintings and the musical instruments and the personal ornaments of the Ice Age tell us that the people who made them had a rich inner life and a complex symbolic world. But there are other forms of evidence for Ice Age spirituality that are perhaps even more striking. The burial of the dead with offerings and ornaments tells us that Ice Age people believed in something that lay beyond ordinary physical existence. At Sunya in Russia, burials dating to around 30,000 years ago contain individuals covered from head to foot in thousands of ivory beads that must have taken years to make. The effort involved in preparing these burials speaks to a belief system in which the dead needed to be sent to wherever they were going, equipped and adorned in a way that reflected their status and their identity. At many Ice Age sites, the bones of large animals, particularly cave bears, have been found arranged in ways that suggest ritual treatment. Whether this represents a formal religion in any sense that would be recognizable to a modern believer, we cannot know. But the evidence is clear that Ice Age people were not simply focused on immediate physical survival. They were engaged with questions of meaning and identity and what lay beyond the visible world in ways that connect them directly to the spiritual traditions of every human culture that has followed them. The genetics of Ice Age humans are beginning to reveal a complexity and a dynamism in prehistoric human populations that was previously unsuspected. In the last 2 decades, the development of ancient DNA technology has transformed our understanding of Ice Age human populations in ways that are still being processed by the scientific community. It is now possible to extract DNA from the bones and teeth of Ice Age humans and to sequence their genomes with a completeness that allows detailed comparison with modern human populations. What the ancient DNA has revealed is that the populations of Ice Age Europe were far more dynamic than the archaeological record alone had suggested. Different genetic populations replaced each other across Europe at different points during and after the Ice Age, in waves of migration and replacement that left the modern European population as a complex mosaic of ancestries from very different ancient sources. The hunter-gatherers who painted the caves of Ice Age Europe were largely replaced genetically by incoming farmers from Anatolia and the Middle East around 8,000 years ago. Then, around 5,000 years ago, a new wave of migrants from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, arrived in Europe and again transformed the genetic makeup of the population. Modern Europeans are the product of these 3 main ancestral streams: the original hunter-gatherers, the early farmers, and the steppe migrants, mixed in proportions that vary across the continent. The Ice Age Europeans who painted the caves were in some sense a people apart, a population that has largely been diluted or replaced by subsequent migrations. Though their genetic contribution persists in small amounts in the DNA of all modern Europeans. Mammoths and their relatives have left a legacy not just in the fossil record, but in the living world around us. The extinction of the woolly mammoth did not simply remove a large animal from the ecosystem. It changed the ecosystem in ways that are still playing out today. Mammoths were what ecologists call a keystone species, an animal whose activities have effects on the ecosystem that are disproportionate to its numbers. Mammoths maintained the mammoth steppe ecosystem by trampling shrubs and trees that would otherwise encroach on the grassland, and by fertilizing the soil with their dung. When the mammoths disappeared, the mammoth steppe began to transition to the tundra and taiga ecosystems that now cover much of Siberia. This transition locked up enormous quantities of carbon in the permafrost of the Siberian tundra that had previously been kept in the soil as organic matter through the grazing and trampling activities of the mammoths and the other large herbivores. A Russian ecologist named Sergei Zimov has been conducting an experiment at a site in Siberia called Pleistocene Park, in which large herbivores, including horses and bison and reindeer, have been reintroduced to a section of Siberian tundra to test whether their grazing and trampling activities can begin to restore the mammoth steppe ecosystem. The results so far suggest that large herbivores do indeed compact the snow in ways that allow the permafrost to remain frozen, and that their presence begins to shift the vegetation back toward the grassy composition of the original mammoth steppe. The mammoths are gone, but the ecological role they played is still important enough that people are trying to fill it with the animals that remain. The Ice Age left its mark on human language and myth, and the deepest layers of our cultural memory. The Ice Age ended around 11,000 years ago, but its effects on human culture did not simply stop when the climate warmed. The memories of the Ice Age landscape, of the glaciers and the floods and the great animals, were encoded in the oral traditions of the people who lived through the transition and passed down through generations of storytelling. How far those memories survived into the era of recorded history is a question that researchers are only beginning to explore. Some linguists have suggested that certain features shared by the languages of indigenous peoples in Australia preserve memories of the rising sea levels that accompanied the end of the Ice Age, with stories of a time when the sea was further away and the land extended to where the water now is. The flood myths that appear in traditions around the world may be garbled memories of the genuine floods that accompanied the melting of the ice sheets and the rise of the seas. The great animals of the Ice Age may have lived on in folklore and legend long after they disappeared from the physical world. Some researchers have suggested that the dragons of European mythology may distantly echo memories of the enormous cave-dwelling predators of the Ice Age. Others have proposed that the giants and monsters of ancient mythology may preserve memories of the great animals that once shared the world with our ancestors. Whether or not these specific connections can be established, what is certain is that the Ice Age was the crucible in which the modern human mind was formed, and that the fears and the wonders and the stories that came out of that crucible are still with us, still shaping how we dream and what we fear and what we find beautiful, in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The Younger Dryas cold event showed how quickly climate can change and what those changes mean for human populations. Around 12,900 years ago, something dramatic happened to the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. Temperatures in Greenland dropped by around 10 degrees Celsius in what appears from the ice core record to have been a matter of decades. The forests that had been advancing across Europe as the ice retreated were replaced by tundra again. The reindeer and the cold-adapted animals that had retreated northward returned to landscapes they had recently abandoned. This cold event, called the Younger Dryas, lasted approximately 1,200 years before ending as abruptly as it had begun, with temperatures in Greenland rising by around 10 degrees in as little as a decade. The Younger Dryas had profound effects on human populations. In the Levant, the region of the eastern Mediterranean that was on the verge of developing agriculture, the cold and dry conditions of the Younger Dryas caused the wild grain stands that had been supporting increasingly sedentary communities to fail and contract. Communities that had been experimenting with the cultivation of wild grains were forced to abandon their settlements and return to mobile foraging. When the Younger Dryas ended and conditions warmed again, the pressure was on to find new and more reliable food sources, and this pressure may have been one of the factors that drove the rapid development of true agriculture in the centuries immediately following the end of the cold event. The Younger Dryas is a powerful reminder that the development of human civilization was not inevitable or smooth, but was shaped and constrained by climatic events over which human beings had no control. It is also a reminder of how quickly climate can change and how severe the consequences of rapid climate change can be for human communities that have organized their lives around particular climatic conditions. The animals of the Ice Age are preserved not only in fossils and cave art, but in the living species that descended from them. Many of the animals that are alive today are the descendants of Ice Age species that survived the great extinction at the end of the glacial period. The modern horse is descended from the Ice Age horses of North America and Eurasia, though the North American populations went extinct, and the horses we know today are all descended from Eurasian stock. The modern bison is descended from the steppe bison of the Ice Age mammoth steppe, though the steppe bison were larger and had longer horns than modern bison. Modern wolves are the survivors of a lineage that competed with Ice Age humans for the same prey across the mammoth steppe of Eurasia and North America. The brown bear and the polar bear both descend from Ice Age bear populations that were closely enough related to interbreed, as polar bear expert genetic studies have confirmed. The muskox, one of the few large mammals to have survived the Ice Age extinctions, still grazes the Arctic tundra in small numbers, looking almost exactly as it did when woolly mammoths walked beside it on the frozen plains. Reindeer and caribou, the most important prey species for many Ice Age human populations, still migrate across the Arctic and subarctic landscapes in patterns that preserve some echo of the great migrations of the Ice Age. And the elephant, the closest living relative of the woolly mammoth, still carries in its behavior and its social structure and its intelligence the legacy of the proboscidean lineage that produced the mammoths and shaped so much of the Ice Age world. The prehistoric art of the Ice Age extended far beyond Europe and reveals a global human tendency toward artistic expression. The cave paintings of southwestern France and northern Spain are the most famous examples of Ice Age art, but they are far from the only ones. In Indonesia, in the cave of Liang Bulu Sepong on the island of Sulawesi, researchers have found paintings of animals and human figures that date to at least 4,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known figurative artworks in the world. The Sulawesi paintings include images of babirusa, a pig-like animal native to the island, and what appear to be therianthropes, hybrid figures that are part human and part animal, suggesting that the spiritual or shamanic dimension of cave art that has been proposed for the European caves may be a universal feature of early human artistic expression. In Australia, the Aboriginal rock art tradition includes works that may be tens of thousands of years old, though dating these paintings is difficult. The art of the earliest Australians includes images of the megafauna that they encountered when they first arrived on the continent around 50,000 years ago, including possible depictions of Gignonis, a large flightless bird that went extinct around 45,000 years ago. Rock art from across Africa, the Americas, and Asia demonstrates that the impulse to create images of the world and of the spiritual experiences that humans sought in caves and on rock faces is not a European invention or a European peculiarity. It is a human universal that appears wherever and whenever the conditions are right for its expression. The permafrost of Siberia is both an archive of Ice Age life and a ticking time bomb in the context of modern climate change. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the Ice Age legacy is the degree to which the permafrost of Siberia and other Arctic regions has preserved the physical remains of Ice Age life. More than 60 complete or near complete woolly mammoth carcasses have been found frozen in the Siberian permafrost, along with thousands of individual bones and teeth. The most remarkable of these finds include individuals with their skin and fur and stomach contents intact, allowing scientists to determine what the animals were eating in the last hours before they died. The permafrost has also preserved the remains of woolly rhinoceroses, Ice Age horses, cave lions, and other animals in a state of preservation that is genuinely astonishing. But the permafrost is melting. As temperatures in the Arctic rise at a rate roughly twice the global average, the permanently frozen ground that has preserved these Ice Age remains for thousands of years is beginning to thaw. This thawing has two consequences that are deeply concerning. First, the Ice Age remains that the permafrost has preserved for millennia are being exposed and destroyed as the ground beneath them melts and the material that held them in cold storage rots and collapses into rivers and lakes. Second, and more significantly, the permafrost contains enormous quantities of organic matter, the accumulated remains of plant and animal life from the Ice Age era that have been frozen for thousands of years. As the permafrost thaws, this organic matter begins to decompose and to release carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. The amount of carbon stored in the permafrost is estimated to be roughly twice the amount currently in the atmosphere. If significant quantities of this carbon are released as permafrost thaws in response to warming caused by human emissions, the resulting feedback could accelerate climate change far beyond what current models predict. The Ice Age, in the form of its frozen legacy in the permafrost, is not simply history. It is a factor in the future of the climate. The story of the Ice Age is ultimately a story about change and about the human capacity to adapt to change. The Ice Age lasted for thousands of years, and during that time, the climate changed repeatedly and dramatically. Warm phases gave way to cold phases, and cold phases gave way to warmer ones. Landscapes that were forests became tundra, and tundra became forests again. Sea levels fell and rose and fell again. Animals appeared and disappeared and shifted their ranges in response to the changing conditions. And through all of this change, through all of the climatic shifts and the landscape transformations and the species extinctions, the human lineage survived and adapted and eventually flourished. Not every human population made it through. There were bottlenecks, periods of extreme stress when human numbers fell to levels that left genetic traces in the diversity of living people. There were populations that vanished entirely, leaving only faint genetic echoes in the DNA of their distant descendants. But the species as a whole survived, and more than survived, developed the cognitive and social capabilities that would eventually allow it to transform the surface of the planet far more completely than any ice sheet ever did. The capacity for adaptation that the Ice Age produced in us is both our greatest strength and, in the context of what we are doing to the climate, potentially our greatest challenge. We are extraordinarily good at adapting to change. We are less good at preventing changes that we ourselves are causing. The Ice Age shows us how resilient we can be. It also shows us how fragile the conditions are that allow our civilizations to function. The agriculture that feeds 8 billion people depends on the relatively stable and warm climate of the Holocene that the end of the Ice Age made possible. The cities and the trade networks and the complex societies that we have built in the 12,000 years since the glaciers retreated are all adapted to climatic conditions that are now changing faster than they have changed at any point since the rapid warming at the end of the Younger Dryas. Understanding the Ice Age is therefore not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It is a matter of understanding the conditions that made us and the conditions that allow us to continue. Ice Age children grew up in a world of constant learning and constant wonder. It is easy to focus on the hardship of Ice Age life and to forget that children were born and grew up and played and learned in this extraordinary world. Ice Age children left their traces in the archaeological record in ways that are both touching and informative. Small handprints and hand stencils appear in several Ice Age caves alongside those of adults, suggesting that children participated in or witnessed the creation of cave art. At the cave of Pecmerle in France, researchers have identified a panel of dots that may have been made by a child based on the size and position of the marks. Footprints of children have been found in the soft floors of some caves, including the cave of Niaux in France, where the small prints of a child estimated to have been around 8 or 9 years old follow a winding path deep into the cave. The child who made those prints walked deep into the darkness of Niaux Cave, perhaps 12,000 years ago, and left their trace in the soft clay of the floor in a way that has survived to the present day. Ice Age children learned by watching and doing. They learned to knap flint by watching adults work and practicing on small pieces of stone. They learned to read animal tracks by following experienced hunters. They learned the geography of their landscape by traveling it from an early age. And they learned the stories and the songs and the beliefs of their community around the fire in the long winter evenings, when the cold outside made the warmth of the group feel like the most important thing in the world. The Ice Age ocean was a very different world from the seas we know today, and it shaped human migration and culture in ways we are still discovering. The 120-meter drop in sea level during the last glacial maximum transformed the world's oceans as dramatically as it transformed the land. The shallow continental shelves that fringe the world's continents were exposed as dry land, creating vast new territories that were available for human habitation. The coast of what is now the southeastern United States extended hundreds of kilometers further into the Atlantic than it does today. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected to each other and to the Asian mainland, creating the vast peninsula of Sunderland that may have been home to large human populations, whose coastal settlements are now underwater. The shallow sea between Britain and continental Europe was dry land, and the rivers that now flow into the North Sea were tributaries of a larger river system that drained the Great Doggerland Plain into the Atlantic. Doggerland was not a bleak and inhospitable place. It was a productive landscape of wetlands and rivers and forests that supported substantial human and animal populations during the warmer phases of the late Ice Age. When sea levels rose and Doggerland was inundated, the communities that had lived there were forced to retreat to higher ground, and the memory of the lost landscape may have survived for generations in the oral traditions of the people who had once called it home. The oceans of the Ice Age were also colder and saltier than modern oceans, and the circulation of ocean currents was different in ways that affected the climate of coastal regions. The Great Ocean Circulation System that today carries warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic and moderates the climate of Western Europe was weaker or interrupted during the coldest phases of the Ice Age, contributing to the extreme cold of Ice Age northwestern Europe and to the rapid climate shifts that punctuated the deglaciation. The reindeer was the most important animal in the lives of Ice Age Europeans, and its story is both practical and profound. Among all the animals of the Ice Age world, none was more important to the daily lives of Ice Age Europeans than the reindeer. Reindeer bones dominate the refuse heaps at most Ice Age sites in Europe, and the tools and ornaments of Ice Age people were frequently made from reindeer bone and antler. Reindeer were a remarkably complete resource. Their meat provided food, their hides provided clothing and shelter covering, their bones and antler provided raw material for tools, needles, harpoon points, and art objects. Their sinew provided thread. Their fat provided fuel for lamps. Even their stomachs were useful as containers for carrying and cooking food. The seasonal migrations of reindeer herds were the organizing principle of Ice Age life in many parts of Europe. Human communities followed the herds or waited for them at known crossing points on rivers where the animals were most vulnerable. The knowledge of reindeer behavior and reindeer migration routes was accumulated over generations and was as essential to survival as any tool or weapon. The reindeer appears in Ice Age cave art with a frequency and a quality that reflects the importance of the animal in the lives of the people who painted it. At the cave of Font de Gaume in France, a panel of reindeer shows two animals facing each other in a composition that some researchers have interpreted as showing a male licking the forehead of a female in a behavior that real reindeer actually perform. If this interpretation is correct, the Font de Gaume panel is not simply a record of an animal, but a depiction of a specific observed behavior that demonstrates the intimacy of the relationship between Ice Age people and the animals that sustained them. The volcanic eruptions of the Ice Age era added another dimension of unpredictability to an already challenging world. The Ice Age world was not only cold and unpredictable in its climate, it was also subject to volcanic events of considerable scale that added another layer of environmental challenge to the lives of Ice Age people. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption in Italy around 40,000 years ago was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in European history and spread volcanic ash across a vast area, including much of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The Toba supervolcanic eruption in what is now Indonesia approximately 74,000 years ago was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years and has been proposed by some researchers as a possible cause of a severe bottleneck in the human population. Around the same time, whether the Toba eruption actually caused a human population bottleneck remains contested, but the eruption certainly produced a global volcanic winter of several years' duration that would have severely reduced plant productivity and food availability across much of the world. Smaller volcanic eruptions were common throughout the Ice Age era, and their effects, including crop failures in the short term and changes in regional climate over longer periods would have added further unpredictability to the already challenging conditions that Ice Age human communities faced. The resilience that Ice Age humans developed in response to all of these challenges, climate change, volcanic eruptions, the extinction of prey species, and competition with other predators, was the resilience of a species that had been tested in the most rigorous laboratory that nature can provide, and that had emerged from those tests with the cognitive and social tools that would eventually allow it to reshape the world. Ice Age astronomy was sophisticated, and the night sky played a central role in Ice Age culture and navigation. The Ice Age sky was very different from the sky that most modern people experience. Without any form of artificial light for thousands of miles in any direction, the night sky of the Ice Age was brilliant beyond anything we can easily imagine. The Milky Way would have been a blazing river of light overhead, and the individual stars would have been sharp and bright in a way that is now only experienced in the most remote parts of the world. Ice Age people were careful observers of the sky. The movements of the stars were a calendar, telling them when to move to particular locations to intercept migrating herds or to find particular plant resources. The phases of the moon were a shorter calendar that helped organize the month, and that may have been used to track the female reproductive cycle and to plan gatherings and social events. Some researchers have proposed that certain sequences of marks found on Ice Age artifacts, sometimes called tallies, represent lunar calendars, records of the phases of the moon kept over months or years. If this interpretation is correct, Ice Age people were keeping systematic astronomical records 20 or 30,000 years before the first known written astronomical observations from the civilizations of the ancient Middle East. The stars also served as navigation aids for people moving across large landscapes in darkness. Knowing which stars rose in which direction and how the position of the stars changed through the night and through the year was knowledge that allowed Ice Age people to travel confidently across landscapes that were largely featureless and to return reliably to camps and resorts, locations that they had visited in previous seasons. The sky was the Ice Age map, and reading it was a skill as fundamental as reading tracks or finding water. The legacy of the Ice Age in modern human biology is written in our genes and in our bodies and in the depths of our minds. The Ice Age did not end when the climate warmed and the ice retreated. It continued in the bodies and the genes and the deep psychological structures of the people who survived it. Our bodies still reflect the adaptations that Ice Age life required. The capacity for endurance running that allowed Ice Age hunters to pursue prey across long distances is still present in the human body as one of its most remarkable capabilities. Human beings are among the best long-distance runners in the animal kingdom, with physiological adaptations including upright posture, long legs, large gluteal muscles, and the ability to sweat copiously that are specifically adapted for sustained running in hot conditions. Our large and expensive brains, which require approximately 20% of our total energy budget, despite being only 2% of our body weight, were selected for in the complex social and cognitive demands of Ice Age life. Our fear of darkness and of large predators, our strong social bonds, and our tendency to form tight-knit groups, our capacity for storytelling, and our need for meaning and narrative all reflect the conditions of Ice Age life in which these qualities were not luxuries, but survival necessities. Even our aesthetic preferences, our love of wide-open landscapes with water visible and trees for shelter, the landscape preference that researchers call savanna preference, reflects the Ice Age landscapes in which our species spent most of its evolutionary history. We are Ice Age animals, living in a post-Ice Age world, and the gap between the world we evolved for and the world we now inhabit is one of the most interesting and important facts about modern human life. The Ice Age made us, and we are still, in countless ways, the people it made.